Welcome back. Got a new section. Last time we've concluded with our section on perfect competition. We go to a new market structure, and in fact, it's the other extreme market structure in terms of one end of the spectrum to the other, and that's a monopoly. And within monopoly, we also talk about price discrimination, which isn't restricted solely to monopolies. Other firms can price discriminate under some, you need some conditions to hold, but this is a good spot for price discrimination as well. So a monopoly, the big thing about a monopoly, a firm that's in a monopoly has the power to set its price without thinking about competition, because a monopoly has no competition, right? It is a single seller. They don't have other competitors. There aren't many markets that are like this. And when we go through the conditions, we'll see why. There are some very specific conditions for us to have a monopoly. Now, there are a lot of firms that have what we'll call monopoly power. They have some traits of a monopoly, but there are very few that are going to hit all of these. So a single seller, a unique product, barriers to entry, right? Single seller, right? This is going to seem pretty redundant, but these top two lines, but one firm has it all. You have one firm that controls the total supply of the product in a given market. Because of that, you're going to see local monopolies a little bit more often than national monopolies, right? You might have a small town that has one barber shop. That can happen. But nationally, there aren't that many monopolies, although you may think of some that one firm provides the total supply in a market. However, we get to the second condition, and we'll see this is a tough one to hit. A unique product, right? If it's unique, there aren't close substitutes. So what do you think of stuff that you've heard of being a monopoly, right? One thing is often Microsoft. Well, there are other operating systems, and in fact, Macintoshes are now, Macintoshes have always been competition for computers that use Microsoft. And in the past few years, tablets have become much more common, and many of those don't use Microsoft at all. So Microsoft isn't a monopoly, right? They have some monopoly power, but they're certainly not a monopoly. What are some other things? The U.S. Postal Service is a monopoly in a way, but there are some substitutes, right? You can pay your bills and send messages through email now. Federal Express and UPS can get you products, although they can't use that box, right? You cannot use the mailbox, but they can get you things. So there are some substitutes. This condition is very, very tough to meet. The idea that you have a unique product without close substitutes. 3, market can't be entered by other firms, right? There are barriers to entry. What are these barriers? Ownership of a vital resource, legal barriers, and economies of scale. And we're going to take a moment to go through each, see what we mean. 3 common barriers that can help create a monopoly. Sole control of a vital resource, right? You can have a monopoly if you have all of a vital resource. So De Beers is a pretty good example, is they control the world's diamond mines. Because of that, others can't sell diamonds. If 25 different firms each had equal control over the diamond mines, you'd have a much more competitive market. These firms would be competing. Price would be a lot different, as we'll see. But if you own all of the vital resources, you have a monopoly. Now, are there substitutes for diamonds? Well, kind of. How close are they? That's subject to debate. There's actually some fascinating economics literature on diamonds and the idea of giving a diamond ring as the engagement ring and the signal it sends. A little bit beyond what the principles class is, but there's all sorts of fascinating stuff on signaling that you see with this. A second barrier to entry is legal barriers. Governments will often only allow a single firm into a particular market. A U.S. Postal Service, mentioned as a monopoly before, that's the only entity that can actually put mail in your mailbox, right? If you try to put mail in people's mailboxes, or not mail, but anything, if you do it by mistake once, you probably won't get in trouble, but eventually you'll get arrested, right? If FedEx and UPS try to do it, they get in huge trouble. They're not allowed to do that. And the crime it's steep if you mess with somebody's mailbox. It's not something to play around with, put things in. So U.S. Postal Service has a monopoly. They're the only ones allowed to operate. Local water and sewer services and cable companies, the idea the government's had here, they didn't want multiple companies digging up lines at the same time, so they've often would grant just one party the ability to operate in a certain market. Now, it's not true everywhere. There are some markets where there are a couple cable companies or a couple water and sewer service companies. But there are some areas where there are only one. And patents. Patents, which I assume you know, this is what's given to you if you come up with a new invention, which allows only you to produce and then therefore sell and make money from the invention for a 17-year time period. This gives you monopoly power. Right? And this is somewhat controversial. One area where patents have become really big and controversial is with prescription drugs. So drug companies will spend a lot of money trying to find new drugs that will improve people's lives, and then therefore people pay for them, but they have a monopoly in those first few years. Normally not 17 because the drug has to go through the FDA process. But then when the drugs come out, companies will often charge a very, very high rate, sometimes $100,000 a year for some of the drugs, or maybe even more. So as far as a normative issue, should that be changed? It's a tricky issue because while the drug price is high and those who want that current drug certainly don't like paying for it, and some lawmakers will say, look, we need to lower this to save lives. If you put in a restriction on drug prices for now and the future, how do you think drug companies will respond? Well, we assume they're going to try to maximize profits. If you cap the amount of profits they can make from their drugs, they're going to spend less research and development on their drugs, which means the next life-saving drug or life-improving drug might never be invented. So in many ways, the calls to lower prices on prescription drugs in the U.S., it's a trade-off, right? How much do you want to improve lives now versus saving lives in the future, right? That's the trade-off. That's not an easy issue. But patents certainly, right in our legal system now, you get a patent, 17 years of monopoly power. Third barrier to entry, economies of scale. We recall from the cost section. Economies of scale is where the long-run average cost constantly falls. Well, when this happens, it'll be cheaper for one firm to provide a product. When that happens, it's called a natural monopoly. To the extent that Microsoft had monopoly power, you could think of them as a natural monopoly, right? It costs a lot of money to develop Microsoft Windows. But once they create it, it's really cheap to get it to the next customer, under $1. So the average cost just keeps falling and falling. There's an incentive for one firm to become huge. Well, that's a barrier to entry because other firms that do it won't be able to get that, won't start off with a huge customer base, and it's difficult for those firms then to enter the market.